Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We seem to have a quorum present, so I'll call this meeting of the full Committee of Ways and Means of the House to order. Does any member of the committee have any business to bring before the committee before we start on our agenda? I don't see any. Senator Rogers, are you with us anywhere? Representative Graves, you recognize to tell the full committee about your House Resolution 651. Please, sir, you can do that from your place at 18.
18, yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Resolution 651 is a study committee that is a result of the discussion we've had with the jobs package dealing with the corporate income tax. And it came to our attention that not only is there corporate income tax that we might want to look at, but other business income taxes. And so it was suggested by the Speaker that we consider a study committee to look at the various income taxes in relation to businesses and in what way might we be able to propose legislation in January to reduce the cost of doing business for businesses and therefore increase jobs for Georgians.
Any questions for Representative Graves? House Resolution 651, I don't see any. What's the will of the committee? I have a motion by Chairman Stevens and a second by Representative Bryant. Thank you. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion do pass, signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, like sign. Proposition passes unanimously. Thank you.
Thank you,
Representative Graves, you're recognized for the purpose of explaining to the committee Senate Bill 55, as we understand it, and then we're also going to hear from Chairman David Knight, who chaired the committee where that proposition was first presented to us. Representative Graves, if you'd take your shot first, then we'll recognize Chairman Knight.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senate Bill 55 was authored by Senator Chip Pearson, and when he brought it to the subcommittee, its focus was when dealing with appraisals that the appraiser's office, and for when they're valuing property for taxation purposes, that they would also consider foreclosures. And from sales, you'll see their bank sales and other financial institutions. And oftentimes when they're valuing property, and I guess is mainly the case right now, as property values have decreased and there's foreclosures in various communities, we want to make sure that when they're considering the value of property that they consider the sales of those properties that were sold through the foreclosure process. And the subcommittee as well, Section 2 was added, which was additional language unrelated to that valuation concept there, but it deals with the conservation use agreements, and I think there's just cleanup language that was recommended through the subcommittee.
Where is that you're referring to?
That would be Section 2 on page 2.
Is that all you're going to say?
Yes, sir. That's
all right. Chairman Knight, you're at which number? You heard this bill in subcommittee. Tell us what your thoughts are on it, please.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. We heard the bill, and as we know, there's a bit of, I guess, concern among the property owners of the state of Georgia as to how the fair market value of real property is determined, and this bill seeks to simply ask that there's some more criteria added in that the assessors shall consider in determining that fair market value. As Chairman Graves has previously talked about, we talked about the foreclosures, bank sales, financial institution-owned property. We also added in property being in a conservation easement, and simply another line or another word, existing factors. So we're just trying to tell our tax assessors they need to consider all in use of the fair market value. Representative Graves did go over the addition of the conservation use section on page 2, and then I think we also went in and looked at how the assessment ratio for the state auditor. We put in some language that would provide that the standard shall only be used to the extent that it does not conflict with the criteria enumerated in this paragraph. In other words, we didn't want our local guys considering criteria, but yet our state auditors, they review the digest to be on another set of standards or criteria as they look at the digest. So we added that language in that there should not be in conflict.
Representative Knight, if I don't mean to interrupt you, but I'm going to suspend action on this bill just for a couple of minutes because I saw Senator Rogers has come in, and if we could, Senator Rogers, we're glad to have you, the Majority Leader of the Senate, former Chair of Senate Finance, and a great friend to the Ways and Means Committee. Senator, which of your two propositions would you like to discuss first?
If it's okay with the Chairman, we'll start with SR1.
You're recognized for that purpose, sir. Tell us about it.
Thank you. I don't have it in front of me, and I do apologize for that, but it's a rather short resolution, and I think I can describe it. Anytime I can get help, I'll take it. This just simply sets forth a process by which we would deal with a surplus for our state budget. Obviously, that's not something that's on our mind at the present time, but there will come a day again when we do have a surplus. And this just says that if we set forth a budget and tell the taxpayers these are all the funds necessary to run your state government, and then they send us money in excess of that, then the first thing we need to do is make sure we take care of the increased student enrollment. That would be priority number one, and for that, the Georgia Association of Educators has endorsed this legislation. The second thing we need to do is take that revenue and set it aside into the reserve fund until the time the reserve fund grows to 10%. I'm not sure we've ever reached 10%. I think the highest is about 8.5%. But if you can imagine right now, if we had a 10% reserve fund, where we could be in this state and what we could be doing and not have to be slashing some essential services. And then if we get to the 10% threshold, then if there's even more surplus beyond that, it would be returned to the taxpayers in the form of paying off state debt or in some form of tax relief. Now the question has arisen that perhaps there comes a time that in the amended budget, when an emergency were to arise and we need to spend some of the surplus money on something, and we have a relief valve for that, and by a 2/3 vote, the General Assembly, by both the House and the Senate, could go beyond the limitation and spend that surplus money if necessary. So this makes sure that if we do decide to spend surplus money, that it is a bipartisan effort and it is something that everybody can agree on. And it's pretty straightforward, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Leader. Number 12, is that Representative Martin?
Thank you, Senator, and former member of the House as well, Mr. Chairman, I believe. Would this be considered to sort of, if you will, stop what sometimes is a feeding frenzy if the governor is able to up revenue projections at mid-year?
Well, I think all governments have this side to them that when they receive excess revenue, they tend to want to spend it as opposed to either saving it, setting it aside, or returning it to the taxpayers. And we are certainly guilty of that in the past.
Well, I was also referring to, Senator, those groups that come in with good projects to do, but maybe that didn't get done. And when I say projects, I don't just mean capital. Isn't it true that they bring operational additions in at mid-year, and we'd have to take care of it 1, 2, and 3 before we could do this, or go to number 4, and it would have to be a real project. So we wouldn't really get into the expanding government business at mid-year. Isn't that true? That
is true. And if we did need to fund something, you could do so with a 2/3 supermajority. But that's probably the way it ought to be. If we're going to spend the excess revenue that was sent to us, everyone ought to agree on what we're spending it on.
number 14, is that,
Thank you.
yeah, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Mr. Leader, would this include the homeowner tax relief grants under that 2/3 waiver, I guess?
Yes, sir. I mean, homeowners tax relief grant would be an expenditure. But beyond that, I think you could also say the homeowners tax relief grant could fall under number 3, which is tax relief to the taxpayers. So if you did reach a point in which you go beyond the 10%, you could use those funds for the homeowners tax relief grant as well.
I missed that part right there. Thank you.
Number 10, is that Representative Flood?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Leader. How would this contemplate specific budget items that might have not been appropriated in the full year budget but were of a high need, like, say, health care? How would something along that order, I'm just using that as an example, but there may be some other areas that might, in fact, require some additional funding that wasn't available during the full year budget cycle?
Well, any measure that's of great importance to the people, to use these surplus revenues, you would need a two-thirds vote to fund that.
But right now, the budget only requires, so that would require a higher standard than the full year budget would.
Yes, sir. Anytime you're dealing with surplus, I would argue that you probably do need to have a higher standard, because remember, the default position is that this money would go into the reserve fund to be used for those same purposes the following year.
Thank you.
Representative Knight.
Yes, Mr. Leader, I applaud what you're doing here. Just a couple of questions, and I would go back to what Representative Flood said. Are we in ourselves limiting something that perhaps at the supplemental budget that in history, and I've only been up here 5 years, but certainly maybe some of our other representatives, senators have been up here a long time. Are we tying our hands in some way that for that emergency or situation has happened with this? That's one of my questions here.
The way I would answer is twofold. I would begin with the fact that because it's a constitutional amendment, the people have to ratify this, and they have to tell us that this is the process they would like for us to follow when they send us more money than what we told them was necessary to fund government. And then the second, I would get back to the manner in which I answered Representative Flood, and that is that if it is something of an important nature, and we're talking about spending against surplus money, then I think it is something that both the majority party and the minority party ought to agree on. And I don't think we've ever had a history of that, but I think if you put the two in balance and say, how many times have we spent the surplus on things that wasn't truly an emergency compared to the times we have spent it on an emergency, I would say that the non-emergency has received a lion's share of the funding, and that's really what we're trying to stop here and say that money we need to set aside into the reserve fund. And I didn't bring my charts today, but if we'd have done this 10, 20, 30 years ago, we would be sitting flush, or we would have come into this session with a completely full reserve fund up to 10%, and that would have been $2 billion.
Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Leader, I agree with the intent of the legislation. I guess my question in today's day and time is if we have to reach 10% before we got to provisions of tax relief for the taxpayers of the state, do you believe that this resolution, or would this resolution keep us, if it passed, from reinstating other forms of relief prior to reaching that 10% revenue shortfall reserve?
I would hope not, Representative Scott. I think obviously we can give the tax relief during the big budget if we're going to appropriate tax relief, and of course this wouldn't prevent us from passing any statutory change that delivered tax relief by changing the rules of taxation, cutting taxes. But I think we would probably appropriate those revenues for tax relief in the general budget. And then if it's a tax relief measure that we all agree on, say homeowners tax relief grant, I think that this past year we were somewhat, everyone was on the same page in making sure we funded the 09 HTRG, then that would certainly be something that would reach the 2/3 threshold. But I would hope that in no way this hamstrings delivering tax relief.
if I may, Mr. Chairman, again, the 10%, that's 10% of previous year's net fiscal revenue, so, which is obviously less today than it was, 1 year ago, 2 years ago, any way you want to put. Would it be better for the taxpayers if it were 7%? I guess is my question. Would it be easier to deliver tax relief, or do? I just question whether the 10% should be constitutional.
Well, I can only, and I have not been around here as long as some, but I can only remember us delivering tax relief through the amended budget process in the form of the HTRG. I think all other tax relief we do through a statutory change of tax rates or exemptions that, of course, would not be impacted by this whatsoever. And we could still do HTRG or any tax relief we wanted in the big budget. That would not preclude this. This is only dealing with the surplus. I'm not opposed to necessarily lowering that threshold from 10% to another number, but I think 10% is a number that we ought to strive to achieve at some point. Having a 10% reserve would make us one of the healthiest states in the United States.
I agree. Mr. Chairman, would you, the bill that we passed with HTRG, do you remember what the threshold was? I thought it was
the last year that it was actually funded plus 3%, which frankly is a lot more benign than this would be. But this is mandated amounts here. That this basically substitutes itself for legislative discretion. I agree with the leader. It needs to be very broad because people up to a certain point elect us to make those very difficult decisions. I don't see in this, especially since you can apply any of the surpluses to debt reduction as well, which we seem to leave out of the argument, that there's going to be any real, I guess, culpability of us not providing enough tax relief to Georgia citizens. I think this just puts a lid on the cookie jar, so to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Beasley T.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you tell me, got two questions. One, can you tell me what is the present bond rating for the state?
Our present rating is AAA.
Okay. So that hasn't changed even though we're in the decline of, at this point, of collecting taxes. Is that correct?
To my knowledge, it has not changed.
So would you be opposed to some kind of way? I would like to see where we could give our constituents money back. So could we use some of the surplus money to help the Department of Revenue to be able to write checks to the people, the citizens that paid the taxes? Because the last time we tried to give some money back to the people, we were told that they couldn't do it because it would cost X amount of dollars. So if we're in a 10% surplus, can we help the department so that we can truly give people something that they can see get money? Can we do that?
I think if you're referencing sending checks out, I think there's a
yes.
I believe when we dealt with this last year, and the chairman may have more knowledge than I do, but I thought we ran into an issue with what's known as the gratuities clause that would prevent us from sending out checks like that, and it would require a change to the Constitution. I'm not sure it would fit in this legislation, and I'm not opposed to the notion of doing away with that and being allowed to send those checks back out. But we may be dealing with two separate issues there.
Okay, thank you.
24, is that Chairman Williams?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Senator Leader, good to have you with us today.
Thank you, Representative Williams.
One of the things I'm kind of concerned about is the politics of this thing. Of course, the governor comes up with his revenue estimate for that supplemental budget. Is he going to be required to follow steps 1, 2, and 3 when he makes his recommendations to the General Assembly?
Well, this doesn't. I guess this doesn't necessarily address what the governor may do from a recommendation standpoint, but it would address where the legislature, future legislatures, could appropriate money as it deals with surplus revenue.
Okay. So if we disagree with the governor's revenue estimate of where you put some money, that it would be up to us, to the legislature, then to remove that. If we want to declare some surplus, that would be where the changes would be made.
Yeah, this would only, of course, deal with surplus. I mean, if you take this year and last year, for example, we're not dealing with any surplus. We're dealing with cuts, so this would not impact that in any manner. This would only be dealing with the surplus, and there would be limitations on where that surplus revenue could go.
Okay, that's what.
One of the ideas is to force, I guess, a more transparent budget process into making sure that when we budget, we legitimately budget, and that we're not kind of splitting the budget in half as we've done in the past, and then when excess revenue comes in, we think up all sorts of new projects to spend it on.
That's what I'm concerned about. If we need to follow this, make sure that we do when we appropriate, when it comes to us to appropriate the money.
I think all of us, I would hope all of us that sit in this room are, if we could go back 3, 4, 5 years and think about some of the projects we funded in the amended budget and say, boy, I'd like to have that money back to spend on education or health care right now.
Thank you.
Chairman Martin.
Thank you, Senator. Going back to the gentleman earlier's concern over the 10%, I was thinking we could change that to make that changeable by a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate. We could put that in an amendment. But isn't it true that really we have that ability in C as it is? I mean, if there exists an emergency that 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate saw the same way, we wouldn't have to fill up the revenue reserve. So really we have the flexibility in that percentage. You just have that good round number in there as a goal for us, and we have the flexibility. So if I were thinking that we could change that 10 to an 8 or to a 12 by 2/3 vote, we really have that in C already, do we not? Was that your thought?
That was my intent, and I guess the kind of the overriding theory here is that when you're talking about a general budget and appropriating tax dollars, it's acceptable that you have 50% plus one vote to make that happen. But when you're talking about surplus dollars, I think that we ought to raise the level a little bit more, because we've told the people of Georgia this is what we need to spend money on, and now they've sent us more money than what we told them, and that excess money I would just like to raise the threshold a little bit as to how we go about appropriating that. And if we don't appropriate it, then of course it would go into the reserve fund, and we could be using it for other purposes when we have downturns like we're suffering now.
Chairman Knight.
Senator, one question on line 16. I just thought about this. Obviously we do increase due to the student enrollment, but it says for local school systems. I know that what was it, 2 years ago we passed the vouchers for our special needs. Does this include that in there, or is that term?
I wish we had the appropriations chairman here now. This is the process that we follow now, of course, in the amended budget, is to fund that additional. I think it's 1% up to 1% for the increase in student enrollment, and I'm not sure how that pertains to the special needs voucher. I don't think it includes it in the current process.
Okay.
But I was
just wondering more about the term. Are we limited here?
I would be a little fearful
here.
Well, we are somewhat, and I would only caution that if you broaden that definition, and let's just say we took it for the purposes of education, then effectively we would never get to filling up the reserve fund as we need to, because the argument would be it all needs to go to education, and we're all in favor of education. But as the representative over here pointed out, one of the things that we enjoy in this state is a AAA bond rating, and having a 10% reserve fund would be the greatest thing we could ever do to maintain that bond rating.
Chairman Stevens, is that right? Oh, you. I'm sorry.
The drunken sailor syndrome that we've had over a period of years, where if the money's there, by God, we're going to spend it instead of putting it in a reserve to prevent these kind of scenarios that we've got now.
It would take us from being a drunken sailor to maybe just a tipsy sailor. But yes, it is designed to address that issue. Yes, sir.
All right. Looks like we're getting a little too far into this. Representative Black.
Thank you.
back to the question about school enrollment. Now, as I read this would exclude college enrollment and use the money for increases in college enrollment. Is that your intent?
Yes, sir. This follows the process that we follow now for addressing the additional students that showed up that we were unaware were coming to our doors.
I'll point out that I like the concept of putting the money in the reserve, and this does not limit it to 10%. And this would only defer to 1 year spending that money if they chose to spend it on something, because they could roll it over into the next general budget.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And if you think about our budgeting process where we have the amended budget and then 2 weeks later we take up the general budget, I mean, realistically, you may not be able to spend it in the amended budget. It has to go in the reserve fund, but you could appropriate it in the general budget if necessary.
So money in the reserve fund, how is that appropriate? That's we can just use that at the discretion of the General Assembly, is that?
No. Well, the governor has to include that in his revenue estimate.
If he doesn't include it, we can't include it in our appropriations bill? Or?
Well, we can't.
It's very formula driven.
Yes.
Okay.
Almost exclusively.
Okay. So would you, because I'm thinking if you do it for the supplemental, sort of the surplus, would you want to use the same sort of criteria for the reserve fund?
Requiring a 2/3.
Or having one, increases due to student enrollment, or, for tax relief, and if both of those are satisfied, then you could use it for something else. But
I'm not sure I followed the question.
Well, I guess you sort of answered it for me when you said the governor has to, put the reserve fund in his budget.
In fact, he just did that in the 09 amended budget that we passed. He took $150 million of reserve money and put it back into the 09 amended to allow us more flexibility for spending and reducing some of the cuts.
I have one last question. I hope it's a brief one, Chairman Martin.
Chairman, it was just to the representative's question about the reserve versus we don't know if we're going to have a surplus when we're doing the big budget. The governor makes the revenue estimate, for instance, for FY10 going forward. We don't know if we're going to be in the positive or the negative there. So what the leader has in place wouldn't fall into really place there, I believe.
The gentleman speaks is correct. Senator, would you like to summarize before we ask for an action by this committee?
Well, I thought this was going to be the easier of the two bills. I think we've covered it about as well as I've ever had to cover it, and I hope I've appropriately answered all questions. But I think it's a good budgetary move and one that a lot of other states employ, and it would really help out in situations like this where we've had major economic downturns.
What is the will of the committee? I have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? 18.
No, sir.
Chairman Gray?
I was just going to move do pass.
Oh, okay. No further discussion. All in favor of the motion do pass signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, like sign. Passes unanimously. It'll be in the Rules Committee. Now, Senator, we recognize you or your designee, if that be the case, to tell us about Senate Bill 240.
Well, I would, if it's okay with the committee, I'd like to bring Representative Levitas up with me.
As long as you can keep him under control.
I can make no such guarantee.
And we're glad to have him, all joking aside.
Good ideas are not limited to any political party, and I will say up front that I flat out 100% stole this idea. I can't say I stole it because he gave me authority to use it. But I took this idea from a bill that Representative Levitas had introduced, and it's received a lot of work since then. And essentially the idea is to establish an alternative expedited process for appealing your property tax assessment. And we worked with the ACCG and attorneys that represent taxpayers on nothing but appeals matters. And this is the resulting project. And effectively what it does is it says that if you do not like the assessment that you've received, you can go and with a professional real estate appraiser get your own valuation on your property. and then offer that to your local county as the actual value of the property. If they, in fact, do not agree with that, then the two of you can, being the county and the taxpayer, can agree on an arbitrator, or one would be assigned. The arbitrator would then determine the value of the property based on either choosing the assessment or the private evaluation that you brought forth. And that, going forward, would be the value established for that piece of property. So it's really just a mechanism that helps put the taxpayer and the government on equal footing, and speed up what is oftentimes a very lengthy process. And I think it will add a lot of credibility to the appeals process for those taxpayers who decide to avail themselves of this alternative method. I'll be glad to speak in greater detail, and also would ask for the committee's indulgence to let Representative Levitas address this as well.
Before we move to, are there any questions for the Senator? 11, that's Representative Peake.
Thanks, Senator Rogers. I tell you, as an owner of several properties, that is the most frustrating process alive, to go through an appeal of your assessed value. You lose every single time if you're just a normal average Joe, unless you hire a lot of lawyers and appraisers, and so I applaud you for moving this forward. Question: is there any provision here? Just breeze through it. That if I go attempt to appeal the value, and I hire an appraiser, and the cost of that is probably going to be maybe $500 or $600, I guess. I think that's probably the standard cost. Who pays that? Is there any potential that if I win my appeal, that's paid for by, or is that just the homeowner's cost of appealing?
Well, this is an alternative mechanism that the property owner would elect to choose themselves. So no one's forcing them to do it. But as far as the appraisal is concerned, I don't believe there's a mechanism that would repay you for the appraisal. But as far as the arbitrator is concerned, the party that ultimately loses the decision by the arbitrator is responsible for paying for that arbitrator. So you, as the taxpayer, if you feel you have a good case and you feel that your appraisal is the proper amount, and you go forward and you win, then the county would have to pay for your for the arbitrator in that matter.
But in the other case, I guess the potential would be that the homeowner would pay for an appraisal, and then if they lost the arbitration, they would pay for the arbitrator as well too. Is that correct?
That is true. One of the things, of course, that we had to keep in mind was if you established a system where the homeowner paid for nothing, then of course everyone would just would just simply do this. So there had to be some risk on the part of the homeowner to bring a legitimate case before the arbitrator, and if they do so and win, of course the arbitrator will be paid for by the county. But I think you, as the homeowner, have to take into consideration what are the potential tax savings by bringing this forward, and is it worth paying for that appraisal?
Okay.
I don't think, I just want to point out, we're not isolated just to homeowners. We're talking about property owners and any aggrieved property owner, which would include commercial property owners as well. But yes, you may follow.
That was actually going to be my question, is make sure it did apply to commercial property. Thank you for bringing us forward. This is a good piece of legislation.
Thank you very much.
You must have several bills over in the Senate that you are looking for.
I just have
don't
several
embarrass
properties.
us and get up and start rubbing his shoulders or anything if you don't mind.
I'll do that. No, I actually just have a bunch of
Much more important than bills.
Chair recognizes Representative Levitas. If you want to tell us about Senate Bill 240, please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as I said before subcommittee, I'll say it again, I always like having the seat next to my property tax hero from the Senate side, Senator Rogers. But in defense of my colleague, Representative Peake, out of 2.5 years of trying to get him to sign on to any bills, even privileged resolutions, I finally got him to sign on to the House version of this bill. So I believe this one actually comes from the heart. I will say that Senator Rogers, what he said is absolutely true, that while both sides, I think, can argue that they didn't get everything they wanted, all the parties, the county, the tax assessors, the folks who represent taxpayers sat down and came up with what they believe to be the very best compromise bill that could pass. And I think from everybody's perspective, everybody agrees that we need something like this. And whether it's perfect or not at this point, it's certainly a very good bill, and it's a necessary and important step forward that gives folks an alternative to the very costly and taxpayer unfriendly system of the general appeals process. So I appreciate Senator Rogers for bringing this forward and for the subcommittee passing it on to full committee.
Any questions for Representative Levitas? Chairman Martin.
Representative Levitas or to the Senator, going through this process, does it afford the taxpayer when an evaluation is set the same lock-in period as is available now when one gets a decision from the Board of Assessors? I think it does. I just thought that would be a worthy question for the committee to know that you do in fact get that same lock-in period.
I know
It does, yes.
It does. I'm looking for the code section.
I don't need to see the one.
Well, it's always a nice challenge. We like to see if he. While he's looking, Leader, do you know if Senate Rules has been canceled for today or not? Have you heard?
Oh, Senate Rules is meeting tomorrow, yes.
Tomorrow, so it's the 3 o'clock today is not in. On.
Correct. It's
Okay.
been canceled to be moved to tomorrow. Lines 74 and 75. It's paragraph 5, page 3.
That's what 485299 does.
Okay. Any other questions for Representative Levitas? In that case, Senator Rogers, would you like to summarize before we ask for action of the committee?
Just briefly, Mr. Chairman, we have worked with all parties involved, and we think we've come out with a good product. It may not be perfect, and when you're dealing with the property tax system, the property tax appeals process, it's going to take more than just Senate Bill 240 to correct it all, but this is a very good first step.
Thank you, sir. Representative Peake, would you like to be recognized for purpose of making a motion? I have a motion to pass. Did I hear a second? Second by Chairman Knight. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, like sign. We get to deal with our warm and fuzzy rules chairman next. Thank you both very much for being
Thank you,
here.
Mr. Chairman. Am I supposed to tell you who's carrying it? Or Representative Levitas will carry SB 240 and Representative Graves on SR 1.
Okay.
I have warned him of the dangers of that, Mr. Chairman.
I'll roll the dice.
Yes. We actually. Oh, okay. We have another arrival, and we're honored to have with us Chairman Chip Pearson from the Senate. You want to be seated or you want to go to the podium? Your preference. Okay. Well, we're delighted to have you, Senator. If you would tell us about your Senate Bill 55, please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I may not be on the right LC number, Ms. Napier. I'm not sure what the last rendition is.
We have 8357S.
Okay. I don't. I know this thing's been a moving target, so I'm probably one behind. If you. Okay. Thank you. We got one here, Lindsay. Yeah. Thank you. This proposal started out simply with on line 21 of page 1, requiring that in the appraisal process that the tax assessor would include foreclosed sales and bank or other REO or things of that sort to make sure that we were really taking into account the value of the properties in an area. It's since grown a little bit to 4 pages, and some of the additions I can comment on, Mr. Chairman, and some of them I may not, since the committee sort of took this thing over. So, but our intent again was to forward the provisions on line 21, item 4. Subsequently to that, we've added line 23, item 5, which was at the behest of those who are involved with conservation easements and so forth, that would be taken into account if in fact it would decrease the value for tax purposes of real property. Over on page 2, we included really all of section 2, again, is dealing with the conservation covenant and the filing times and requirements for filing those if there's an appeal that is going to be made on an assessment. Page number 3, section 3 was something that was put in. I think Mayor Powell put that section in during our last work session to, I believe that's the one that brought consistency with some other code sections that was required. And then section 4 is basically requiring that notice be given whenever a valuation increases or decreases, either goes up or down, that the property owner is made aware of that. We had folks that brought to us issues where that is not in fact being done. So, Mr. Chairman, that's the kind of in a nutshell the extent of it. Again, I can comment extensively on line 21. Beyond that, it may be more appropriate for Ms. Napier to comment on a lot of her work in there.
Well, Senator, the concern was that we didn't apply two different kinds of methodology toward arriving at appraised values under that generic phraseology in our state law. And the ratio studies are entirely sort of a niche unto their own, and we just want to make sure we applied the same methodology to all these professional undertakings, and I'm satisfied that we've lawyered this thing to death. So.
Well, and I appreciate her help, and let me say she's a pleasure to work with and very bright, certainly in this subject. So.
And very much undeserved by this chairman. Chairman Peake.
Chairman Neal, this may be a more question, maybe to Lindsay even as well too. The reasoning for adding the language for the conservation easement. I mean, when you put a piece of property in a conservation easement, isn't that already determining that it's going to have a lower fair market value? I mean, are you looking for comparable property to come up with a fair market value next to a conservation easement?
Are you talking about 23, lines 23, 24?
Yeah.
That came from the Senate. I'm guessing not comparable properties, but just maybe on the actual property that maybe they weren't using. They weren't depreciating. They weren't taking the value down because of those things. So I guess the Senate
that was an amendment that was put on the Senate side, and I think Steve here, you might want to speak to that specifically.
The conservation easement language was placed only because we have found throughout the state that oftentimes when property is placed in a conservation easement, that local taxing authorities do not take into account for purposes of establishing the value and assessing the taxes, whatever diminished value there might be, if in fact there is any diminished value, because the owner has given up development rights or whatever, it's diminished the value of the property at the end, and therefore we feel that should be reflected, of course, in the property taxes. Now, a lot of times that property is already going to be in a conservation use covenant and already in a preferential tax treatment, if you will, and it's not likely to have reduced the value. So that's the reason that is in there. Kurt Soper with the Georgia Land Conservation Council, and Jim Stokes with the former CEO of the Georgia Conservancy, and I all agree that this would remove an obstacle potentially to folks considering putting their property in the conservation easements, knowing that the tax assessors have to take that into account. So that's the simple reason that was placed in this legislation. We appreciate Senator Pearson allowing us to interject this bill.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Peake, does that answer your question? I didn't hear an answer in any of that.
I'm not sure it did. Mr. McWilliams and Senator Ross, I mean, the conservation use agreement I think is a great one. and glad we passed it last year, but if I'm using that as a comparable piece of property to determine the fair market value on another piece of property, I mean, is that fair?
You
Is
said
that
conservation use, so let's make sure we're making a distinction here between a piece of property that's in conservation use and a piece of property that has been placed in a conservation easement.
Okay.
Therefore, giving up, the landowner, may continue it as a working farm or a working forest, but he does give
Right.
it forever
Okay.
any development rights. So you have to make that distinction. We're not talking about property that's in CUBA, conservation use.
Okay.
We're talking about conservation easement.
Okay, well, that does make a little bit of difference, but does it make sense that it seems like we're maybe giving an unfair advantage to a piece of property getting a lower listen, I want property values as low as they can get, but it seems like maybe we're getting an advantage to somebody who's getting a comparable value using either CUBA or a conservation easement.
I don't see it that way.
Okay.
We're just trying to move an obstacle to conserving forest land and working forests and working farms in the state. While this may not come into play, and certainly will not come into play with the majority of conservation easements, there are times when it might make a difference in a landowner making a decision about whether to give up forever those development rights on the property.
Okay.
I think this just permits using the placement of the property in, and we're not talking about CUBA, and typically these conservation easements are perpetual. Once you say that you're never going to use the property for anything but growing grass or whatever the easement purpose, that's it. And it has a value established on that very, very limited use thereafter, and this just permits that valuation for that particular taxpayer. I mean, I think it was just felt that it needed to be added to this since this was other permissive valuation criteria.
But it wouldn't be used for comparables in a
Where do you
system
see comparable?
Well, I thought that was the whole purpose of this, is when we determine fair market value, you're using these items. You're using...
Well, but you could use a comparable conservation easement property to a comparable conservation easement property.
Right, okay.
But you're not calling one that doesn't have it comparable to one that does, if that's what your question is.
That's my question, yes.
I don't think the language does that. If it does, it's flawed. I don't read it that way.
Okay.
Chairman Martin?
Mr. Chairman, I was going to ask the difference that you articulated. This is not CUBA. This is a conservation easement. That was my question.
Representative Flood?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of clarifying questions. Are landowners compensated for conservation easements?
They typically are, yes.
And what would
In
be...
one form or another. It's tax credits ordinarily and that sort, and deductions at the federal level.
And what would be the difference between line item 3, line 19, and line item 23?
Well, there could be additional covenants or restrictions that are outside of a conservation easement or covenant.
Covenants that run with the land typically are limited in time and scope. If there's not, they can, I think by law, only extend for 50 years, and if there's no time restraint given in covenants that run with the land, they expire in 20. Obviously, their effect on value is far less than a conservation easement, which is in perpetuity. I mean, you've just set this property aside to hold together the rest of the earth from now on.
And one last clarifying question, just so I understand it. Is there an implied diminishment in value if the property has a conservation easement? Could the property actually be worth the same or potentially more because of an easement? This assumes that the value is decreased. It doesn't give the same treatment if the value is the same. It basically says you use this if the value of the property is diminished by the easement. What if the value is the same or higher because of that easement?
I don't know of an example in which a property's value would be the same or higher, because you're now, once you have this easement on, again, as the chairman said, this is a permanent, perpetual easement. It's not a 10-year conservation where you put it in and can take it out. Basically, that means that whatever any other use that may be allowed within the local zoning or that is not prohibited by covenant or restriction would be restricted by that conservation easement. So by definition, I think you are devaluing the property for some consideration that is specific to what that easement, the details of that easement and conditions of that easement.
I agree, Representative Flood, though I think you've picked up on the nuance of the language. The other criteria are essentially permissive. But you're right, this does presuppose decreased value. And there might very well be circumstances where they're in a conservation easement, there might not be. And I think the language here is we're codifying that there's always going to be a decreased value. I'm not so sure if that's the best thing for us to be doing, but we got that from our friends in forestry and so forth.
Well, Mr. Chairman,
but that's a good point that you make, I believe.
It would be my interpretation that because we're simply saying that the tax assessors should consider it, that would, in considering it, if they determined that in fact that the property was not decreased in value, they simply would then reflect that in their assessment. And if you as the property owner don't agree with that, you certainly have the opportunity to appeal.
Well, just one.
I know that's what you intended, but I think the way it's worded that it could be interpreted just like Representative Flood said, because the word decreased is written there. If what you intended was there, they would consider as a criteria limitations based on property as a result of being in a conservation area. It wouldn't say decreased value. It would say just limitations would be considered in the overall valuation methodology. I think that's a point for technical lawyers to argue over and or smarter people than me. Representative Flood, you want to continue?
That's it. Thank you.
Chairman Knight. You don't have to push your buttons to wave, everybody. You can just do that there and tell you what to. Senator Pearson, would you like an opportunity to summarize your legislation before we ask for action by this committee?
Yeah, I thank the chairman and the members for considering this bill, and again, it's simply our desire that unfortunately in light of the situation in the decline in property values, the numbers that we've seen for last year, it's in excess of 1% a year, and certainly a continuation of that would lead to potentially some near catastrophic result in certain areas. We certainly want to see that turned around, but in light of that fact, we believe that we owe the property owners certainly the right to have these foreclosed properties and distressed properties considered when their property of like type in the same area under all the other rules that govern these appraisals that are in place, have that considered so that they're not paying more than they necessarily should in light of the housing economy we're facing now. So we hope that this bill offers that along with some of the amendments that have been made along the way, and would ask for your favorable consideration.
Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, what's the will of the committee? I have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? Any members of the committee wish to be heard on the proposition? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye. Opposed, like sign. Senator, we're happy to submit this to our Rules Committee. Thank you very much for your patience with us, and sorry we kept you waiting.
Thanks for the help.
Chairman Martin Scott, would you take the chair, please?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. At this time, I assume that you would like to be recognized for the purpose of introducing a piece of legislation, and I would give that to the chair for his discretion. Which piece of legislation would you like to introduce?
House Resolution 624.
Mr. Chairman, you are recognized to present H.R. 624. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a resolution for a study committee that I consider a bit long overdue. We've got a lot of what I would call obsolescence in our code dealing with certain fees by accruing to our constitutional officers. which span as much as 70 or 80 years of lawmaking. We really haven't kicked these tires or turned over these rocks in a long time. Sheriffs, probate judges, superior court clerks, tax commissioners, magistrate judges, and the like. This study committee will be to try to get all these fees organized before us, look at the efficacy of them as well as the fairness of them as they relate to the everyday life of taxpayers. Fees really are nothing more than additional taxes on our citizens, and obviously sometimes they stay under the guise of being a fee as opposed to a tax, but I think it's time that we get some folks that are trained to look at these, to consider the obsolescence, consider the fairness, and consider the parity out there for all the citizens of our state going forward. So this is a resolution asking the Speaker to organize a study committee of those probably willing to volunteer to do this and put the time and effort in and report back to this General Assembly with their findings next year. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll be happy to yield any questions. Otherwise, ask for the favorable consideration of the committee.
Mr. Chairman, it looks like a good piece of legislation. I'm surprised it's taken us 230 years as a state to come up with this. I'll at this time be happy to entertain questions from the committee. Chair recognizes Representative Jay Powell, number 27, for the purpose of questions.
Mr. Chairman, the fees that you're talking about, would those include some of the add-ons like clerk's retirement, law library fees, and things like that that are added on to some of those filing fees?
It would be my desire that it did. All those at one time seemed like really good ideas, I guess, evaluated in isolation. But I think the point you're making, and I agree with the gentleman, as a learned attorney in your area, we've seen how these things have stacked over time, and we're busting at the point of unreasonableness on a lot of these things. And we just want to get an idea so that we can present back to this General Assembly what they are, why they are, and if action needs to be taken, then we'll have the data available to do so on a fact-based basis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
At this time, the chair sees no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman O'Neill, as I glance at the specific fees that are being looked at, sheriffs, probate judges, so forth, they all appear to be fees enacted by local governments. What is the posture of the General Assembly to position ourselves to determine the relative viability of fees across 159 counties?
Ordinarily, I agree with you, and ordinarily, you're right when I don't. But it's my observation, at least, that a lot of these fees are in state code as well, and it would be my intention with this study committee to look at all of them as an aggregate, both from the parity standpoint, the reasonableness standpoint, and just the identification of this General Assembly, what they all are, if that's a fair answer to the gentleman's question.
I guess the more appropriate question is it the intent to analyze the fees or to try to get some methodology of determining which fees and how much those fees ought to be across the jurisdictions that we're looking at? Is it the intent of the study committee to look at the fees just from a technical perspective, or is it looking at it to try to make some recommendations on what fees ought to be?
Well, both. I think the first order of business would be identification of all the fees, whatever they are, at really every level of government up through state. I don't think there's anything we can do about federal government, but so that we can thereafter make fact-based decisions on their reasonableness, on their obsolescence, if they're at that stage or not, and going forward. I would suspect that we would submit a finding of the committee to this General Assembly to use as a database to determine if action was necessary in the future.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
All right. Are there further questions from members of the committee at this time? Looks like we have one from...
Make a motion at the appropriate time, Mr. Chair.
Let's wait and see. Are there any further questions? Seeing no further questions, then we'll entertain a motion at this time.
Move to pass.
We have a motion and a second. At this time, is there any further discussion on the measure? Seeing none, all those in favor of the measure, H.R. 624, signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Unanimously carried. Mr. Chairman, congratulations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. An excellent job as usual. Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, that concludes our agenda for today. Is there any member that wishes to bring any business before the committee before we adjourn? Seeing none, thank you for your service as usual, and we stand adjourned.